The Godfather is a virtual masterclass in leadership, so today I will evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the strongest individual leaders that we encounter throughout the 1972 film. I chose 7 characters whom I felt were interesting for one reason or another. Some people may disagree with my choices, but I felt that these 7 were particularly instructive on some level. First, though, I should stipulate that screen time is important here. Salvatore Tessio, for example, played by Abe Vigoda, is one of the 2 capital regimes under Don Corleone, but he's simply not around enough to be evaluated properly, except that Michael Corleone praises him as being shrewd, smarter than Clemenza before arranging for Tessio's murder. We don't really get a sense of the leaders of the other families like Philip Tattaglia or Emilio Barzini. Characters like Fredo and Luca are not really leaders, so there isn't too much to say about them. Some become more important in the sequels, but we don't see too much of them in The Godfather like Al Neri. The leaders presented in the 1972 film are incredibly diverse, each a true study in character. Here are the 7 I will talk about today. Virgil Sollozzo, Peter Clemenza, Sonny Corleone, Jack Woltz, Tom Hagen, Michael Corleone, and finally Don Vito Corleone. Okay, so I'm starting with Sollozzo, played by Al Lettieri. Within the Godfather franchise, Sollozzo may be the most ruthless opponent who emerges. However, his ruthlessness is moderated by an unusual sense of pragmatism. He's never reckless. For example, since he sees himself as a business person first and foremost, he takes a meeting with the Corleone family, optimistically hoping to come to an equitable agreement. But once he realizes that Don Corleone will never agree to help finance and protect his burgeoning narcotics activities, he begins to view the Corleones as being in his way. In other words, in the world of you're for me or against me, they are now his enemies. When he realizes, at the meeting at which the Don rejects his proposal, that Sonny Corleone actually likes his business proposal.
Are you telling me that the Tattaglias guarantee our investment?
Wait a minute.
And he might otherwise have considered the deal if not for his father.
Santino, what do you think?
There's a lot of money in that white powder.
Sollozzo comes to the conclusion that he has no choice. He has to murder Don Corleone to ensure the success of his new venture. The novel The Godfather by Mario Puzo informs us that the Don had been shot previously in the course of being Don, but in the film, Sollozzo is the only one we meet with the wherewithal to try to remove Don Corleone, physically. And for all intents and purposes, despite the Don kind of figuring out the way Sollozzo is leaning, Sollozzo essentially succeeds. That is, the button men do get a clean shot at Vito on the street, and it all should have been over then. Sollozzo's problem was the quality of the hitmen he hired to do the job. Somehow they put 5 slugs into Vito, but none of them are kill shots, which would have won the day for Sollozzo. In the novel, Sonny concedes that Sollozzo is, quote, the smartest man our family ever came up against. Of all the people in The Godfather who say it's business, not personal, Sollozzo seems like the only person that actually means it. Moreover, family consigliere Tom Hagen advises Sonny that if the Don dies, the only logical decision next up will be to work with Sollozzo.
If your father dies, you make the deal, Sonny.
So Sollozzo's strategy is quite sound and reasonable. If Tom Hagen agrees with your way of doing things, that actually means something. In addition to the big picture, though, Sollozzo is a tactics man as well. He knows that Don Corleone's personal enforcer, Luca Brasi, is a wild card that has to be neutralized in order for the later assassination of the Don to be successful. Luca is unstoppable, a kind of one-man army for Vito Corleone. Ultimately, it is Michael Corleone who truly sees Sollozzo for the menace that he is. Michael understands that Sollozzo's full of surprises, like bribing Captain McCluskey to remove all the security from Don Corleone's hospital room after he survives the shooting so that Sollozzo's men have yet another opportunity to remove the Don. In the novel, Michael sees Sollozzo as bold, clever, and a man of extraordinary force. In short, someone to be feared. In the end, successfully being able to remove Luca was extraordinarily fortunate for Sollozzo, but he could not double down on his victory because the subsequent assassination failed to kill Vito. He needed both things to occur in order to secure his position. Ironically, and as happens very often in life, the difficult and unlikely part, Luca, was shockingly simple, and the easy thing, killing the Don when he was only being protected by Fredo, somehow didn't work out. When Sollozzo later tries to make a truce with Michael Corleone, it is a sound move. He is assured that Michael is unconnected to the family business, thus not a particular threat to him and nowhere near as hot-headed as Sonny. Because of this, Michael is able to get close enough to kill Sollozzo and Captain McCluskey in Louis' Italian-American restaurant in the Bronx. Again, Sollozzo's only oversight is that he doesn't really know who Michael Corleone is, and so he underestimates him, which is a theme in the Godfather films. Sollozzo's death is in many ways far more unlikely than the success of his original plan, which was fairly foolproof. In many ways, Sollozzo remains someone who really thought everything through, and his plans probably should have succeeded, but he was unlucky and died in a restaurant in the Bronx in the 1940s instead of being a mover and shaker in the narcotics trade in New York. Then again, the life expectancy of someone in his line of work might not be that long. As the Don so eloquently puts it,
But your business is a little dangerous.
Still, he was a formidable leader in terms of having mastered strategic thinking. The problem is always delegation. He's the kind of man who plots things out on paper first, but things oftentimes go differently in the real world, especially when underlings are involved. But on strategy and vision, he was more than adequate. And something lives on after him. Michael Corleone learned an important lesson from Sollozzo, that being respected like his father may be less valuable in the end than being feared. Next I will look at Capo Regime Peter Clemenza, played by Richard Castellano. Clemenza is best remembered for the following quote.
Leave the gun. Take the cannoli.
This displays a certain wit and pragmatism. Why would he waste a perfectly good cannoli? It was suspected that Paulie was a traitor since he had called in sick the day of the hit on Don Corleone. Thus an order was given to permanently remove Paulie from the equation. Later, Clemenza shoots and kills Victor Strozzi, and later executes Michael's brother-in-law, Carlo. When Don Corleone agrees to do Amerigo Bonasera, the undertaker from the opening scene of the film, the favor of getting justice for his daughter, the Don deliberately delegates the job to Clemenza. He explains he does not want someone doing this job who could get carried away. Clemenza listens well and properly interprets the tone of what he's being asked to do, the level of violence needed in each different scenario.
Paulie sold out the old man that struts.
I don't want to see him again. Make that first thing on your list, understand?
Understood.
He is also interested in world affairs. While talking to Michael prior to Michael's going to the Bronx to meet and kill Sollozzo and McCluskey, Clemenza and Michael discuss the war and how the Allies unadvisedly appeased Hitler at Munich in 1938. He also has an understanding of leadership, making a case that purging the ranks occasionally is a healthy way for the families to renew themselves, getting rid of the bad blood, and probably leads to more creative and original ways of running their businesses. Clemenza is a kind of mentor-type leader. At one point, he even tries to instruct Michael on the best way to cook a sauce. His joviality is his defining feature. There's one point where he makes a joke at Paulie's expense when they are discussing going to the mattresses.
They're clean. They told me to exterminate them.
Exterminate? That's a bad word to use. Exterminate. Get this guy.
Everyone thinks this is a reference to what is about to befall Paulie in a few minutes' time, but I have sometimes wondered, since Peter Clemenza is such a student of the war in Europe, which had just recently ended, whether this was really some kind of early reference to the Holocaust. After all, the Nazis used this term extermination frequently to describe the destruction of the European Jews. At that moment in the 1940s, with the American press printing photos and stories of the concentration camps, the term extermination may have been a truly loaded term, though it is interesting to note that Puzo does not employ this sub-reference or anything like it in his novel. It seems likely that Paulie meant to say decontamination. In any event, Peter Clemenza uses the strength of his own personality to create familiarity and loyalty from among his own people. He is a strong leader, and he seems devoted to teaching others how to lead as well, as he sometimes does with Michael. He knows his job inside and out and understands the value of simply terrifying people, as he describes them pain-in-the-ass innocent bystanders, rather than maiming or killing them. If Clemenza has a weakness as a leader, it's that he has become a bit soft with age. In the novel, it's mentioned that 10 years of peace with the other families have eroded his energy and capacity to lead troops into battle. Still, he remains logical and methodical in his approach to his work. And he is good at delegating, as when he promises that the gun Michael will need to kill Sollozzo and McCluskey will be planted in the washroom in exactly the right spot where it needs to be, and that his part in the plan to kill Sollozzo will not fail. And he's correct. You can count on Clemenza.
The gun will be there.
Perhaps most significantly, Clemenza is the first person to kiss Michael's hand and call him Don Corleone before El Neri closes the door to the office, ending the movie. The next leader I want to discuss is Sonny Corleone, played by James Caan. Don Corleone's firstborn, he is the most honest of nearly everyone we meet in The Godfather, except of course when he's cheating on his wife, but otherwise he's really honest about his intentions to the point of being nearly childlike. He cannot keep from giving away the store on occasion. His behavior is irresponsible, at times reckless for a leader in a position of power.
What did he say?
What did he say? Ba-da-beep, ba-da-bap, ba-da-boop, ba-da-beep.
His decisions are unsound and never seem to evolve from a logical process of reflection. He is unoriginal and even plotting in his decision-making. His temper determines what he does next. He is unable to contain his worst impulses. This inevitably creates untenable situations, as when his anger at Carlo Rizzi, his brother-in-law played by Gianni Russo, for hurting Connie, his sister played by Talia Shire, leads Sonny to behave in ways that become so predictable that his enemies are able to stage a situation of domestic violence that leads to his being assassinated at the causeway, once again going out to beat Carlo in retaliation for Carlo assaulting his sister Connie. At the initial meeting with Sollozzo, after showing that he was interested in the deal which empowers Sollozzo to attempt to murder the Don Corleone advises Sonny never to let others outside the family know what he's thinking again. The Don knows that Santino is not disciplined and is prone to distractions of all types. He seems to have a hard time focusing on any one thing. The Don knows all of Santino's weaknesses, especially his incapacity for felicity to his wife, and famously tells Tom Hagen that Sonny wasn't a particularly effective Don. Sonny never once played anything close to the best. His intentions are always clear, too clear. After Sollozzo's men attempt to murder Don Vito, Sonny cannot contain his indignation and vows to avenge his father at all costs. His temper was by far his worst flaw as a leader and eventually led to his murder on the causeway. He mistreats others like Tom Hagen.
God damn it, if I had a wartime consigliere of Sicilian, I wouldn't be in a shape!
This doesn't even have the virtue of being true. He's in the position he is because he could not keep his goddamn mouth shut in public. In the end, Sonny was a poor leader, motivated by impulses to act rather than logically arrived at decisions. He cannot protect the interests of the Corleone family. Hell, he can't even protect himself. And it is not really that he was assassinated, but how he was assassinated. His decision-making is so poor that he's totally alone, and the assassins can really take their time. They just keep shooting him over and over and over. His motivation to protect his sister was laudable, of course, but such an obvious flaw that his enemies knew immediately how to exploit it. And all they had to do was co-opt Carlo. That's it. Then they would have Sonny at their mercy. In the end, it can be said of Sonny that he was memorable, but perhaps not for the right reasons. He should have listened to reason and his consigliere more, whether Sicilian or not, screamed less, and tried to have been more like his father in all things, controlled and reasonable. But he seemingly learned nothing from Don Corleone. Violence should have been a last resort, but for Sonny it was mostly a starting point. This made him, together with his other flaws as a man, extremely vulnerable and subject to manipulation. His heart was pure in many ways, but it did not benefit the family. If anything, the ease with which he was assassinated made him seem like an even weaker leader than he actually was. The next leader is a wild card, and one you might not expect, but I truly believe he's a leader worthy of consideration here, the movie producer, the Hollywood bigshot, Jack Woltz, played by John Marley. In some ways his flaws are so obvious and glaring that he is a study in contrasts, and watching him is instructive generally in showing how a leader should never behave. Woltz is really different from the other characters we meet in The Godfather. He's all ego and no pragmatism. Clearly he poses no obvious threat to the Corleones, but he somehow values taking revenge on Johnny Fontaine over having a profitable future relationship and friendship with Don Corleone. In case it's of interest, when Tom Hagen flies out to Hollywood, there is a memorable song playing called Manhattan Serenade, written in 1928 by Louis Alter. Anyway, in the novel, Hagen is stunned by the short-sightedness of Woltz. Because Woltz has apparently been successful despite having no sense of how to think strategically or broaden the base of his business, Hagen eventually advises Vito Corleone that the family might wish to enter the film industry. Clearly it is run by short-sighted men. Woltz is ultimately gambling that the Don will not play hardball with somebody refusing to grant a favor, like giving the Don's godson, Johnny Fontaine, an important part in his latest film. This stuns Hagen even more in the novel. He cannot see how a man's personal vindictiveness could blind him so completely to the fact that the Corleone family is dangerous and tends to get what they want, and in this case, Woltz's life would probably be a better one with a friend like Vito owing him a favor. This opportunity simply falls into his lap, and as the old saying has it, he was unprepared for success. Instead, Woltz is interested in appearances only. Clearly the short-term satisfaction of screwing over Johnny Fontaine meant more to Woltz than Don Corleone's friendship and gratitude. And Woltz is well aware of who Tom Hagen is and who he represents when he makes this catastrophic choice. He even knows the band leader's story.
Yeah.
I heard that story.
In essence, the Corleones teach Woltz a valuable lesson, namely that there are worse things than appearing ridiculous, like waking up with a horse's head in your bed, which it could be argued, inside the dramaturgy of a Hollywood film, would definitely make Woltz appear even more ridiculous.
And a man in my position can't afford to be made to look ridiculous.
Ultimately, in the novel, Hagen concludes that Woltz was not stupid, but supremely egotistical. And as a pragmatist, Hagen laments having to go to war with an unworthwhile adversary over a stupid issue like Johnny Fontaine and a Hollywood starlet. Eventually, the horse's head in his bed makes Woltz realize that there is no reasonable check on the power of the Corleones, that having no fear of consequences means that Don Corleone is essentially a god, and that Woltz must, if only to protect himself, give Johnny Fontaine the part in his movie. It is hard to say whether Woltz learns anything from this unpleasant experience beyond that might is right, but he is clearly a man who does not consider the big picture, despite being a producer in Hollywood. He is petty and spiteful and cannot fathom who he is dealing with, despite knowing exactly who he is dealing with. His insults, though, are the best when he tells off Hagen.
I'm German-Irish.
Well, let me tell you something, my Kraut Mick friend.
But he lacks the capacity for thinking beyond superficial issues. He makes decisions, it is true, but they lack vision and inspiration. He cannot think beyond his own satisfactions and pettiness. He is thus a very flawed and vulnerable leader who in all likelihood does not fully grasp this even after a horse's head turns up in his bed. He still thinks in terms of life being a zero-sum game. Someone like Hagen knows this is an illusion, that sometimes life presents you with an unparalleled opportunity to advance your own cause, like the Don offering you his friendship to not fuck over his godson, which will ultimately cost you nothing, and you have to be wise enough to grasp this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when it comes your way. This makes Woltz a short-sighted leader at the very least. The next character who interested me was Tom Hagen, played by Robert Duvall. Not a Sicilian, he was a German-Irish street kid whom the Don took in and cared for. In return, Hagen eventually becomes the buttoned-down, rational face of the Corleones' business and legal affairs. Whenever he appears in the film or the novel, he is calm and controlled and rational. He is somewhat like Don Corleone in this way. He has insights, but they're never quite as trenchant as those of Don Corleone in terms of sizing things up rapidly. Of course, Sonny is right about him, that Tom is not a wartime consigliere. In all scenarios, he wishes to eschew war in favor of tried and true business practice. This is smart, of course, but it also shows his main limitation. He lacks versatility. He does not know how to comport himself in time of war. He tends to think only in legal terms, as when Kay wants to get a letter to Michael after he flees to Sicily, but Tom declines to take the letter since in a court of law that would indicate he knew of Michael's whereabouts. Sometimes thinking in strictly legal terms is a weakness, since it cuts him off from people and prevents him from really and truly examining what might happen next. He tends to play an entirely reactive game, and he never gets ahead of things. It is possible that Don Vito's evaluation may not have been entirely accurate.
I never thought you were a bad consigliere. I thought Santino was a bad Don.
Sonny was probably a bad Don for sure, but Hagen's incapacity to serve Santino well, to adapt to another kind of Don, ultimately jeopardized Sonny's chances from the beginning. We see Tom Hagen at his weakest when he is convinced, like everyone else, an obvious example of groupthink, that there is no way to get to Sollozzo when he's being guarded by McCluskey. It takes an outsider, Michael Corleone, to point out that a corrupt police captain will not be viewed by the press or the public in the same terms as a law-abiding citizen or an honest police officer. McCluskey was on the take and was employed as a bodyguard to Virgil Sollozzo. Michael reasons correctly that McCluskey's murder might be viewed differently, as though he got what was coming to him. Though he apparently possesses a thorough understanding of what is permissible and what isn't legally, Tom Hagen is nevertheless a man who cannot inspire others. Now we come to Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino. He may be the smartest person in the family in terms of thinking outside the box. He starts out as a kind of sweet person, but gradually evolves into an entirely different man, forced to change by circumstances into a true leader of men. He is someone who doesn't have many of the same problems as the other characters previously mentioned. He's adaptable and capable of seeing the truly big picture before anyone else. While Hagen is still arguing that no one has ever gunned down a New York City police captain, Michael is trying to figure out how this might be done, if it is to be done, by painting McCluskey as being on the take. This wins over Hagen, which could not have been easy. Significantly, Michael is never sentimental. He's succinct and direct. When he decides to replace Tom as consigliere, he simply says, "You're out, Tom." You know where you stand with Michael, at least if you're in the family. In the Puzo novel, Hagen truly comes to admire Michael's leadership. Michael grasps the threat from Sollozzo immediately. He sees before anyone that the Turk has to be dealt with first and foremost, or Don Corleone will never be safe. He realizes that Sonny and Tom Hagen are totally myopic in their view that McCluskey and thus Sollozzo are invulnerable while together. Why can't you murder a totally corrupt police captain, he asks. It's a good question. Think different is how it might have been put by Steve Jobs. But even Tom Hagen doesn't see how original a solution this is for a while. Michael knows how the media deals with mafia stories. They treat the murder of those inside the mob as more of a joke than anything else, not the same as the death of an ordinary man or woman. Michael's greatest strength as a leader is that he is adaptable. He wants a certain sort of life outside the mob, but he realizes that he has no choice but to kill Sollozzo and McCluskey, and that this will change the trajectory of the rest of his life. Even before this, in the hospital with Enzo the baker, Michael is totally calm and saves the day by remaining in control, calling Sonny for help and then convincing the assassins that the hospital has not been abandoned. Afterward, though Enzo is so terrified he cannot even light his own cigarette, Michael takes the lighter and helps Enzo out, and we cannot help noticing that Michael's hands are as steady as a surgeon's. He is a leader by nature, but also by necessity, as the case might be. He tends to think about the big picture and how he can eliminate enemies and make the family stronger on an ongoing basis. He is unsentimental and incredibly strong emotionally. Mind you, he knows this comes with a price. He is a lonely and isolated leader and deeply troubled by the facsimile of a life that has replaced the existence he had wanted, apart from the family. Nevertheless, he remains an adaptable and effective leader. The last character, and the most fascinating and personally charming, is certainly Don Vito Corleone, played by Marlon Brando. He is incredibly sharp about sizing up his opponents and evaluating situations. He uses favors as a kind of currency for building up his power base. Helping people solve their problems makes them feel indebted to the Don and brings them under his influence. These close personal friendships become the basis for exercising and maintaining power. Don Corleone notices the weaknesses in others immediately and plots how to exploit these shortcomings. In the novel and the film, it is clear he knows each of Sonny's foibles and that he is aware that Sonny would have to change a great deal in order to be an effective Don. Above all, the Don values reason and tries to work out problems peaceably before the disagreements become violent. After he learns of Sonny's murder, his instant response is that he wants no acts of vengeance taken. Never reckless, he wants to study things and see who's truly responsible. This is wise and a well-considered strategy to keep things from going out of control. From the moment he learns of Sonny's murder, Don Corleone knows he's back in charge, and he immediately delegates a number of tasks to Tom Hagen. The Don is the master of delegation. He implicitly trusts his people to carry out his wishes in exactly the right way. He also calls a meeting of the 5 families. At this point, and even after the meeting, Hagen knows enough to listen to and not question what the Don thinks. The Don always has useful insights into human behavior. At the meeting of the 5 families, Vito realizes almost immediately that Philip Tattaglia is the least of his problems, that Don Barzini is also involved somehow. He deduces this from the fact that Don Barzini has thought things through a little too much for the Don's liking, making up too many excuses for Sollozzo's aggressive behavior. Everything is a little too detailed and thought through. As Barzini puts it,
a refusal is not the act of a friend.
Of course, neither is shooting someone in the street. Apparently Barzini wanted to enter the narcotics trade, and having Philip Tattaglia and Vito calling a truce makes it easier for him to get what he wants. Unlike most of the others discussed here, Don Corleone does not utter threats and never loses his patience or his temper. He is never out of control. Together with his capacity for introspection, Don Corleone is probably the most complete leader in The Godfather. Everyone learns something from him, and he is the ultimate teacher for those who spend time with him. He knows how to delegate and even grasps that he must replace himself when the time comes. The importance of succession did not elude him, and he was just as happy, perhaps happier, as Michael's consigliere than he was as Don. With the notable exception of the assassination attempt, he has things largely under control throughout the film, and his ultimate survival is due to having loyal people around him. Even after McCluskey pulls all the detectives and private security out of the hospital, Michael and also Enzo the baker are there to ensure that Don Corleone is able to survive. He ultimately pulls through and becomes Don once again after Sonny's murder. Though things do not always go Vito's way, unlike most people, he does not lament his bad luck or bitch and moan like Johnny Fontaine.
You can act like a man! What's the matter with you?
He learns from his mistakes. Ultimately, he tries to think about what comes next, and how he will go about undertaking the tasks that appear before him. He is by far the best adjusted and strategic leader in The Godfather. Michael comes close to being a leader like Don Vito, but he's not quite up to it. He has a better brain for business, it's true, but he has little personal warmth or charm, and is isolated over time, whereas Vito is exceptionally social and enjoys his personal relationships. Michael escalates things to levels that Vito might not have allowed them to, such as alienating his wife and killing his brother-in-law Carlo and orchestrating the murders of the heads of the other families and Mo Green. These sorts of things were not beyond Vito. We see what he was forced to do to survive and prosper in the flashback sequences of Godfather 2, but he deliberately chooses to live a different kind of life than the one that Michael sees as necessary to his own survival. Michael has a certain way of looking at things, and the notion of peaceful coexistence with his enemies is especially problematic for him. Michael's is necessarily a more confrontational journey through life. He wants to be feared. Respect is nice, but not necessary. Conversely, Don Vito valued personal respect above all else.
Don said, what have I ever done to make you treat me so disrespectfully?
The Godfather remains relevant to the study of leadership even today. The 7 characters that I've chosen to deconstruct are all really different from each other in both style and substance. Still, watching how they behave and their mistakes and their successes can prove instructive in evaluating how best to lead others. I hope you enjoyed watching this evaluation of the individual skills of the characters in The Godfather. It was fun to write and edit. Feel free to like and subscribe.